Morning, we are in Mem Aleph Amud Beis 41b. It just struck me that being back here in the library is full circle post-COVID. We're davening upstairs in the small shul. The share is back in the library where it started. So, Baruch Hashem, things are someone. And Barry Kaplan's here.
Thank God. May just continue.
Yeah. Okay, so we are on 41b, Mem Aleph Amud Beis. And the next little bit, the Gemara is going to have a discussion on the subject of flattery. Now, we began to raise the issue yesterday that there's a kind of subtlety here. There's a nuance. On the one hand, the sages in the Gemara despise flattery, especially when it's exaggerated and borderline false. And as we learned yesterday, Friday, once flattery began, specifically under the rule of Agrippa the king from the line of Herod, who was of questionable lineage and therefore was always constantly felt his claim threatened, and that sometimes, or often, unfortunately, leads to a king being more despotic in nature. So there was the sages would flatter him in an attempt to, I suppose, keep the peace, to keep him happy with his subjects. And specifically, what we're talking about here is this event of Hakel, when Agrippa is as king leading the service and reading from the relevant sections of the Torah, as is the mitzvah of Hakel. And when he did that, and he got to the section where he reads about a king having proper lineage, he began to cry. And the sages tell him, "You're our brother," because his mother was Jewish. Rabbi Gimel sent me an email in which he notes that there's a dispute as to whether a king has to have both mother and father Jewish or just mother Jewish. Likewise, he noted a Tosfos, which makes a similar discussion to what we were discussing on Friday, as to whether the fact that the problem with the flattery was the fact that he was a Jewish king, whereas not Jewish kings might have been acceptable, as we discussed yesterday, because flattering a not Jewish king was part of the way in which communities, and specifically the Jewish community, would lobby on behalf of the king to keep the Jews alive. Yeah. So there's a nuance here. On the one hand, as we began saying, once flattery began under Agrippa, it corrupted society. All of a sudden, truth is not obvious. Compliments aren't real compliments. Criticism isn't real criticism. Everything is all confused when there's flattery. You can imagine a society in which flattery doesn't exist, then whatever a person says, they mean what they say. But when there's flattery and everything's an ulterior motive, then a person gets a compliment in the back of his head. Well, what does he want from me? Why is he complimenting me? Right? And everything ends up becoming corrupted, as we described on Friday. Yeah.
Fabric of trust.
The fabric of that's right. The trust, the societal trust that you say what you mean and you mean what you say, gets lost in a society built on flattery. That was the original comment. On the other hand, as we're going to learn today, if flattery is going to keep people alive, then go flatter, if that's what's necessary. Right? So there's a kind of balance somewhere here. It's certainly pekuach nefesh, right? The truth is, the Gemara elsewhere discusses even, it's not exactly the same thing, but it's a similar kind of discussion in which the Gemara discusses a certain kind of a lie, even, that would be allowed for the sake of peace. Where is it? Right? With Avram Avinu. I have to remember the details of the story. Avram Avinu says something to keep the peace between him and his wife. Anybody remember? Didn't we learn this at this table?
I remember.
Remember? No one? I going blank. Yeah, between husband and wife, between him and his wife. He said something to the angels about where his wife was at the time. Can't remember. Anyway, for the sake of the Gemara, they're concluded for the sake of peace. A person might be able to, not a full lie, but say something that, or omit certain truths. I don't remember the exact detail. But it's a similar kind of thing here, which is if flattery is necessary to keep the peace, especially quite literally when you're talking about a king who has the capacity to take people's heads, then flattery is what's necessary, then so be it. And that's what's going to come up today. So there's this kind of like a balance in understanding that flattery is inherently a negative, but not an inherent immorality. In that if in the cases when it's needed, it should be used. And there's the big question that a person has to ask himself: where's his flattery coming from? And what's the agenda? And what's the relationship I have with the person I'm flattering? And is this going to contribute to a dishonest relationship with people around me? Or is this strictly a means to an end because I'm talking with a person who is capable of destroying everything, and flattery is the way we're going to keep the peace? The person must be very careful about that. And that is going to come out in the discussion we're having today.
In other words, it has its place, but it's very sparingly.
Right, but the Gemara's first comment is that it's a negative. Flattery arrived, society is corrupted. Then the Gemara goes on to say, well, hold on a second, because there are times when you need it. In other words, it's not like a neutral element that could be used one way or the other. The starting point is that it's negative because it isn't honest. But you should know that there are times when it's necessary to keep society functioning. I used on Friday the example of Jews in Russia today. Here in America, speaking truth to power is, yay, good for you. Go call out the government. In most places in the world, you can't do that. You call up the government, you end up in jail or worse. So for a Jewish leader to be a hero and call out the government and in that way get his whole community locked up is just foolish. So if you have to flatter a madman, so be it. You got to flatter a madman. That's what you got to do to keep your Jewish people alive. So be it. And that was the reality for most of history, for most countries. Today, thank God, last couple of centuries, in a select few Western countries, we have, thank God, the ability to criticize our governments without worry of repercussion. That's not the case for most of history, and even today, for most countries, it's just not the case. I mean, even in countries today where, like, the Arab countries where there's a good relationship between the Arabs and the Jews, you don't think the Jewish leaders in these Arab countries have to be careful about what they say when? Because they say the wrong thing, that whole beautiful relationship's gone. It's not like in America today or in Canada today, where you say whatever you want, and the next prime minister comes in and makes a difference. That's just not the case for most of the world, and certainly for most of history. So under these circumstances, it's not.
I'm thinking of it in terms of the opposite. The opposite of flattery is criticism.
Yeah.
When would you do it? And I think in both cases, it's very much the same answer.
Yeah. So we were talking about that on Friday, that when flattery and the dishonesty that flattery brought to society didn't just ruin compliments, it also ruined criticism. It ruined everything. Because when in a world of truth, then I can criticize and it's truthful, and I can compliment and it's truthful. In a world that's not truthful, my compliment isn't a compliment because it's agenda driven, and my criticism isn't truthful, it's also agenda driven. So it ruins everything. Yeah. On the other hand, especially when it comes to relationships with government, a person has to, these things are sometimes necessary. The Mishnah has, in Pirkei Avos, a number of different statements regarding relationship with local authority. On the one hand, the Mishnah says, the Mishnah praises those who lobby on behalf of the community, including to the local government. A person should pray for the priests of the government, because if not for the government, not for the authority, one person will swallow up another. Right? Society would crumble if there's no strong government. On the other hand, the Mishnah tells us, be careful with your relationship with the authority, because they use you when they need you and they dump on you when they don't need you, right? So you have like the Mishnah telling you need to get involved with the government, yes, but just be careful, because just know what they're about and know when to use flattery, knowing to use a strong arm, and so on. Okay, so let's see some of the Gemara's comments today on that in that context. So after the Gemara,
That was a big issue. Sorry.
yeah,
That's a big issue for some of the sages that used to lobby on behalf of the Jewish people.
certainly,
In Rome.
starting in Rome
And
and then throughout history. Absolutely. Yeah,
I'm sure they had to employ these tactics. And like
certainly.
you said, that's survival.
Yeah. The Abarbanel was very close and comfortable with the king and queen of Spain while the Inquisition was going on. At the end, took him out as one, and he failed to keep the Jewish people from being thrown out of Spain. But he was working with them, trying to, as best as he can, make the Jewish life comfortable in Spain. Like this, many other Jewish leaders throughout history. Okay, so we're a little bit lower in the middle of the page. The line begins with the word mimasecha, and the second word is darash. So having the Gemara established, as we did on Friday, that inherently flattery is a negative, and that it corrupts society, and it's become an untruthful society. The Gemara now goes the other way and tells us when flattery is permissible and sometimes even necessary. Torah Shebuhuda bar Marava. Yehuda literally means son of the west. Marava is west. So I presume he came from the west, meaning he came from Eretz Yisrael. So Yehuda bar Marava said, the Itema, and others say, that the following teaching is not from Yehuda bar Marava, but rather Rabbi Shimon ben Pazi from Rabbi Shimon ben Pazi. Now, the teaching is as follows, whoever it was that said it. Quote, it is permissible to flatter the wicked in this world, as opposed to once Mashiach comes. Shenemar, as the verse reads, Lo yikara oid lenaval nadiv. We will no longer refer to a novel as like a despised person. Nadiv, we will no longer call him a prince. This is a reference to the Messianic era. When Mashiach comes, we will no longer refer to the, right, it's from Isaiah, Yeshayahu. When Mashiach comes, we'll no longer refer to the despised one as a prince. Ulachili actually translates the word kili for us. A person who's constantly desires alcohol. That's what it actually tells us. Ulachili into the, I guess, alcoholic. Layomer, what's the pronunciation of this word is? Shoiva, right? What is the pronunciation? Yeah, Shoya. We no longer refer to him as a nobleman. So because the verse prophesies that once Mashiach comes, we're no longer refer to these people in flattering terms. The implication is, continues his teaching, that as of now, shari is permissible. The prophecy is telling us that when Mashiach comes, we're no longer going to flatter them. Today you can. Right? And again, I guess suppose the reason is because you're talking to a wicked person. And if the way to make sure him not being a menace to society is by flattering, then flatter. There's no choice. The other option is provoke him and have him wreck society. That's what it seems like. I have to be honest. I'm struggling with the Gemara quite a bit, as you can tell, because you also don't want to, like it can become like a whole game where like this person has a hold over society and everybody has to dance around him, because if not, he's going to go spastic. He's going to go postal. But on the other hand, you have to flatter. So like there's this very strong balance to be. It's very nuanced and very difficult, because the Gemara keeps going back and forth. It's good to flatter, not good to flatter. Good to flatter, not good to flatter. We're going to go back and forth in the Gemara. So
it's clear. It's olam sheker.
Yeah.
And you have to work within the constraints of that.
That's what it seems like. Right. On the other hand, you don't want to, via that flattery, make this wicked person have a hold over the whole society, basically dance around him. Right. So you have to find this. It's not easy.
It's gray, it's not black and white.
Not at all. Gemara's going to go back and forth. Good to flatter, not good to flatter. Yes, flatter, no flatter. Okay.
It seems like there's two issues going on here. One is our Jews' relationship to
the wicked. let's say, non-Jewish wicked
authority.
versus
And,
Jews
you know,
within Jews. Yes.
This all started with
Agrippa was a Jewish
Hazael
king.
and a Jewish king, but
That's
you
right.
could go off on in my opinion, an entirely different issue, which is how we treat non-Jewish authority. But I don't see.
Yeah, so I don't know that okay, so that's a good point. I don't know that it's a different issue so much as it's context. In other words, okay, so there's a negative aspect to the fact that they flattered Agrippa, but in context, you should know the other times when it's appropriate. That's kind of what the Gemara is doing here, right? So the Gemara is establishing that it's a negative trait for a Jewish society to have this flattery business. On the other hand, there are times when it's necessary, right? So the Gemara is go back and forth.
Right.
We're going to see further. That's right. It seems negative, period, but it's necessary under certain circumstances. But we're going to see soon in a moment. We're going to learn from Yaakov. Flatter. Okay, we'll see. Okay, Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish says, Mehacha. Here's where we derive that you may flatter the wicked. And this comes from Yaakov's conversation with Esav. When he first meets him, I'm looking at the verse on the side, where it says, Vayimer Yaakov, and Yaakov says, perhaps he asks of Esav to see favor in his eyes. Please take my gift, because I've seen your face, and it looks like the face of God, or the face of maybe like an angel, and the face of the godly. That's right. Your face, says Yaakov to Esav, looks like the face of a god, the face of the angels, the angelic creatures. And it pleases me to see you, it pleases me. So here we derive that flattery to the wicked is appropriate, because look, he's flattering the wicked. But Upliga de Rabbi Levi, deriving from this statement that ubiquitously a person is allowed to flatter the wicked, or at least so seems the implication, this is in contrast to the opinion of Rabbi Levi. Rabbi Levi says, you got to understand the situation here. Mashal Yaakov Esav, a parable, an analogy to describe the situation and the relationship, the dynamic of Yaakov and Esav. Lamad Davadomer, to what this can be compared analogously. L'adam, to a person. Shezimin Chaverai, who invites his friend, vehikir boy, and the friend realizes that the person who invited him wants to kill him. Right? So here's the point, which means Rabbi Levi is saying that Yaakov and Esav situation is where Esav wants to kill Yaakov. Which means Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish, who disagrees with Levi, says even when there isn't an issue of killing, you can still flatter. Right? But flatter because you want to flatter the wicked, why would you do that? So maybe it's not for murder, it's for some other issue, just to keep society functioning. There's some sort of nuance that has to be struck here. I'm not sure what it is.
Very limited use of
that's right.
flattery.
So Rabbi Levi says it's limited only to when there's a question of murder. Right? But it seems like Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish is taking it more broadly. Right? Because he's disputing Levi. Levi limits it to the fear of murder, life and death situation. Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish is a little bit broader. But anytime you want to walk over to wicked people and flatter them, that's Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish's view. Obviously not either. So I'm not exactly sure where that line is drawn, but it's clearly that the Gemara itself is struggling to find that line, having established that flattery is negative. Okay, so let's continue with the analogy here. So Levi said the analogy is a friend invites another friend, or one fellow invites another fellow. So fellow B realizes that fellow A who invited him wants to kill him. So Omer Loi, fellow B tells fellow A, Tam Tavshel Zeh, the taste of the food that you just gave me, Shani Tayim that I'm eating right now, that you served me, Ketavshel, it tastes exactly like the food, Sheta'amti, that I tasted, the Beis HaMelech, in the house of the king. Now, why is he dropping not just buttering him up, he's also dropping rank.
That's true.
He's telling him, oh, you know the food you just gave me? It tastes like the food I had at the king's palace last week. He wants to let him know, hey, I know the king. Mess with me, and the king's going to find out about it. So Amar, the person's going to say, Yadale Malka, he knows the king. And Mistaifi, I should be afraid of him. Well, I'm not going to kill him. So in effect, Rabbi Levi says, this flattery was also a veiled threat.
Yeah, it wasn't really.
So it's flattery, but a veiled threat. That's right.
Passive aggressive.
It's passive aggressive because the guy's about to murder him. right? By telling him, so Yaakov is telling Esav, oh my gosh, you look exactly like the angels. Wink, wink, I know angels. Mess with me and you have angels messing with you. You have angels to contend with. And that's the point of the story here. So it's a flattery, but it's also a veiled threat. It is, so
Where did you derive angels from the king's house?
in the analogy.
Oh, from
The analogy, what
Esau?
Yaakov said to Esav, you look like the face of the king. So that's, in the analogy, he's telling him the food tastes like the king's food. But in the analog, in the story of Yaakov and Esav, he tells him, you look like a god, informing him, I know what gods look like. I know what angels look like. So be careful with me. Right? So it's almost like Rabbi Levi is saying that if you're going to flatter the local government, make sure there's also a message you want to send. Something like, you wouldn't want to ruin your stellar reputation. Right? I have to, what's the story? Oh, this is the story. There was a Yid who met with the Rabbi, who was connected with the, it wasn't the Yid. It was under Kennedy. I can't remember the names, but here's the story. Story like this. The Rebbe instructed a person who was either he was connected to the Kennedy administration, specifically to the Department of Foreign Affairs, something of that nature. And at the time, through some negotiation, there were Chabad Hasidim who were being released from Russia. And this was through the American negotiation with Russia. So America agreed to put the release of these Chabad Hasidim on the negotiating table to get them out of Russia in their negotiations with Russia. But said, we're not going to take them into America, they'll go to Israel. And the reason they'll go to Israel, not to America, is because it's more insulting to the Russian government if they come to the US. So we're going to negotiate with Russia that they're free, but at least publicly speaking, it won't be us doing it. They're going to Israel, not coming here. Now, these Hasidim want to come to America to see the Rebbe. So through someone, the Rebbe sent the following message to the US department that was doing the negotiation. The message was like this. If these Russian Hasidim go to Israel, not to America, we're going to have front page headlines in New York Times that read something like, refuseniks finally reach freedom, America rejects their entry. Right? So it's like, you have this wonderful reputation as a free country. You wouldn't want us to ruin it now, would you? So very quickly, they were given permission to come to America. I'm totally ruining the story, but this is just the story. There are names and dates and places which I'm totally missing. But the point being that if you're going to be a flattery, then it should come from a position of strength, not from weakness. That's what Rabbi Levi is saying here. It's not just, what I'm suggesting is that Rabbi Levi is not just telling you that only flatter when it comes to an issue of murder. Rabbi Levi says more than that. Rabbi Levi says that this flattery is done in such a way that it puts you in a position of power. Where you flatter the guy by saying you look like a god. Yaakov's flattering Esav by telling him you look like an angel, but that puts Yaakov in a position of power. I know angels. Follow? So even as you go about flattering, make sure it doesn't compromise your strength. And that's perhaps another element of what Levi is saying. Not just that he's limiting it to a question of murder. Also, the manner in which you're going to flatter shouldn't weaken your position when you're negotiating with the wicked government, specifically. Maybe something like that. Sorry?
Two pieces. First, you use flattery when you're dealing with wicked, but even in that circumstance, you have to use it in such a way that it strengthens your position.
That's right. It's strengthening. In the flattery itself, there's a veiled.
With wicked people.
That's right. There's a veiled threat in the sense that it puts me in a position of power, puts the Jewish people in a position of power. Maybe that's perhaps another element of what Rabbi is saying, not just limiting it to a case of death. Again, I'm struggling with all this, and I'm sharing it with you as we go along, because clearly there's a nuance here. Okay. Amar Rabbi Elazar. Rabbi Elazar said, this is a very strong statement, which reads as follows. Kol Adam, any person, sheyesh bo chanufa, that has within him this character trait of flattery, maybe af la'olam, brings wrath to the world, which is so counterintuitive. You would think you're bringing flattery, you're bringing so much goodness, you're complimenting everybody, right? But compliment is not flattery. Flattery is exaggerated. Flattery is deceitful. It's deceitful. It's agenda-driven. So a person who has this character flaw, in which he's constantly manipulating others around him via the use of flattery, brings wrath to the world. Shenemar, as the verse reads, Chanfe Lev, and those who are flattery of heart, or hearts that are of agenda-driven flattery, Yasimu Af shall bring wrath. And moreover, Elashe'ein Tfilasha and Nishmas, their prayers aren't heard. Shenemar, as the verse reads, I pronounce the word Yishavu, God will not pay attention to them. Ki Yasaram, because he's going to bring upon them, what's the word? For they are afflicted, meaning even when they're afflicted and they're praying to God to get out of their affliction, God will not pay attention to them because of their flattery. Which perhaps the reason for this is, if the person is a deceitful person and everything he says, again, look at Rabbi Elazar's words carefully. He doesn't say anyone who flatters brings wrath, and anyone who flatters his prayers interred. Anyone who has flattery in him, meaning if the person is using flattery under the correct circumstances when necessary, good. But if he is a flattering person, meaning to say he has his character flaw in which everything he says is dishonest, and this is the kind of person who brings wrath to the world. That's the way he describes it. Not kol adam she'mechanev chaverei, anyone who flatters his friend. That's not what he says here. It says sheyesh bo chanufa. He has within him flattery, and the verse describes it as chanfe lev, people who have flattering hearts. Their hearts are full of this deceit and this dishonesty. They're the ones who are bringing wrath, and their prayers not answered because their prayers not honest either. Everything's agenda driven. They're complimenting others, it's agenda driven. They're talking to God, it's agenda driven. It's always deceitful.
Flattery is not a tool which you use in the case of need.
It's a character flaw for this person.
It's inherent in
That's right.
this person.
That's right. So, and perhaps for the thread of the Gemara is something like this. The Gemara starts off by saying, we did this on Friday, that flattery corrupts society. Then the Gemara says, hold on a second. There are times when you need this. When you have a wicked person and you need to deal with that, sometimes flattery is a necessary means. Rabbi adds and says, even when you do that, make sure it doesn't put yourself in such a way where the guy you're flattering now has control of everybody because you're flattering him all day. Flatter him in such a way that it puts you in a position of power. And then finally, the Gemara says, if you're the person who has the job of flattering the wicked, make sure it doesn't become a character flaw. Make sure you remember that this is a means you need to get X, Y, Z done, but make sure it doesn't become a character flaw and that you ingrain within you that problem, which is actually one of the interpretations of the Mishnah. The Mishnah we quoted earlier, which says, have a zehirim baroshos, be careful with your relationship with the local authorities, right? So the literal meaning of the Mishnah there is, be careful in your relationship with authority, because as the Mishnah goes on to say, because they dump you when they don't need you, and they use you when they do need you, right? A deeper reading of that Mishnah is, because they're the kinds of people who dump you when they don't need you, and they use you when they do need you, be careful in your relationship with them, lest you become like them. That's right.
Start out, you have good intentions.
Exactly. Lest you become corrupted. That's correct. lest you become corrupted by the career you've chosen here. That's a deeper reading of that Mishnah. It's not just be careful because they're going to dump you and they don't need you, but be careful when you're cozying up to them, lest you become like them. And maybe that's the flow of the Gemara here also. After the Gemara begins by saying flattery corrupts society, and then the Gemara gives a qualification and says, well, there are times when you need it, and make sure it puts you in a position of power. But be careful that if you're going to go down that route, and by God's design, you're the one who has to make sure that you're flattering the wicked to keep everybody alive, make sure it doesn't corrupt your heart. Maybe perhaps this is the flow of the Gemara here. Oh, yeah. Okay. God willing, tomorrow, the Gemara is going to have more commentary on the nature of someone who got flattery in his heart, not just someone who flatters. But as you're going to see tomorrow, call them shish bechalufa, the same language. Anyone who has flattery in his heart. There are some times when the Gemara is going to say anyone who flatters his friend. And we'll have to see the distinction between having flattery in your heart versus someone who flatters his friend, and see if we can come up with something there as well. It's a lot to think about. I hope there's more clarity than struggle, but you can see I'm struggling with this Gemara because there's obviously a nuance. The Gemara is going back and forth here. Have a wonderful day, Yidden, and we'll continue, God willing, tomorrow. But tomorrow's a Chodesh. Next week is our Chodesh.
Yeah.
Okay, so maybe the classes will be a little bit shorter and a little bit later, but we will at least learn something. Okay, have a good day.
God bless you, Rabbi. Thank you, Yeshikoach. All the best to you all. Have a wonderful day.
You too, thank you.
Judge, good day.
Thank you.